In 1998, I thought life was pretty good. I was new to the school I was attending. I'd recently left the privately owned daycare where my mom taught preschool and where I'd gone to kindergarten and first grade. I went to a class in a room that was divided between second and third graders. And even though I was extraordinarily shy, especially around the bigger kids, I enjoyed my time at school. I had lots of friends for probably the first and last time of my life. It isn't to say that I never had friends, but I never had that amount as I did at that age, as a result of moving around a lot later on. I did well in my class. My teachers liked me, and I liked them for the most part. I had a crush on a girl named Sonia, who consistently outperformed me. She wasn't crazy about me, by the way. At home, things were good too. I had a baby sister who was about a year old, and so still much too small and cute to be annoying in any way. Even though my grandmother, who I loved dearly, had moved away from our town the year prior, I still got to visit her a lot, and she drove down to see us whenever she could. My parents' marriage was still going well, or at least it appeared to be. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if there were any cracks that had begun to form, they weren't yet obvious to me. And they wouldn't be for another 2 or 3 years. Yeah, like life seemed pretty grand to my young mind back then. I always wanted to race through the year. I could never wait to get through most of it. I was in such a rush to get to fall. I looked forward to October, best of all. Not only was it the month of yellow, orange, and red-leaved trees, Halloween, spooky costumes, and all the candy I could eat, that was the month in which I had my birthday. Even though my mother also had a birthday in October, the very day after my own, by the way, somehow the fact that I'd been born in October when I was a kid, it seemed to make the month mine. And in October of that year, I turned 7. Looking back, it was definitely one of the better birthdays I ever had. My present, which I'm pretty sure my parents let me open a few days early, was a Sony PlayStation, complete with a small collection of games. Some of the games were used, some were discounted, some were brand new, but who cared about any of that? This was my first console. Not the first video game system that we'd ever had in the house, but the first one that, with my name on it, that had been purchased for me, with me in mind, with my birthday in mind, and not handed down from an older family member or bought at some garage sale somewhere. And I had a stack of games, 2 controllers, and extra memory cards. It's time to get the party started. My favorites were Crash Bandicoot 2 and the original Spyro the Dragon. Yeah, October, like the PlayStation, like the good life, belonged to me. And because it was mine, it meant it must be wonderful. And for me, it was. But that wasn't true for everyone. The Meaning of Matthew is a biographical memoir written by Judy Shepard about her late son, Matthew Shepard, whom she refers to most often as Matt. 21-year-old Matt lost his life as a result of a savage beating he was subjected to by Aaron McKinney and his accomplice, Russell Henderson, in Laramie, Wyoming, on 7th of October, 1998. According to his doctors, Matt was struck upwards of 18 times by McKinney, who used the butt of a handgun to do the job. The third of these blows was severe enough to damage Matt's brainstem, leaving him alive but unconscious and unaware of his circumstances or surroundings. Among the litany of tragedies and travesties involved in this case, it's extraordinarily sad that this, of all things, should be counted as something of a small mercy. By no means do I say this to exonerate his killers, nor to diminish the full weight of Matt's suffering, but he was left tied to a post, bloodied and beaten and exposed to the elements throughout the night. It was nearly a full day before he was found, knowing that he couldn't have been aware during this period of time is a small and meager comfort, but it's better than the alternative. As he clung to life in a Colorado hospital for the next 5 days, vigils were held, some headed up by celebrities. A frenzied press coverage ensued. Gay rights activists, fundamentalists, pontiffs, and pundits argued over the details, and all the while Judy Shepard and her husband Dennis and their younger son, Logan, were fighting their way home to be with Matt during what turned out to be his final days on Earth. After his death, his wake would be interrupted by the Westboro Baptist Church, who came to protest with scornful messages such as their infamous slogan, "God hates fags." His parents would go on to form the Matthew Shepard Foundation, and to this day continue to fight for justice, not just for gay rights groups, but for all peoples. Judy Shepard, who wrote the book, chooses to tell the story of Matt, warts and all. The thing is, this most famous of tragedies was not the only difficult time in her son's life. Matt moved around and traveled a lot during his high school years. On one such occasion, he traveled with a group of German tourists around the city of Marrakesh in Morocco. When separated from the group and exploring on his own one night, he was attacked by a gang of men, robbed, and repeatedly raped. This drove him into periods of depression that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and even caused him to experience difficulties with prescription drugs and alcohol. His mother, Judy, does not sugarcoat things in her account, nor omit embarrassing details. Like many of us, especially when we are young, Matt was indecisive and changed his career and study goals several times while at school. He smoked cigarettes at home with his friends and covered it up when confronted by his folks. He called up at obscene hours to talk about whatever was on his mind. He was a terrible driver. But what I loved about hearing these last few stories is that it made him into a real person. They filled in an incomplete picture. The coverage of the case is invariably about how Matt died and the impact that it had on the public, both in America and abroad. There are those who tried to demean him and tear him down, saying that he wasn't the perfect poster boy for gay rights, or that his image shouldn't be venerated because of his flaws. But the thing is, nobody is, nor should strive to be, the perfect poster boy for anything. That's not why we're here, to fuel anybody's campaign spin. That's not the way in which we live our lives. To reduce somebody only to that is to miss the point of life entirely. In this account of her son's demise, Judy takes time not simply to recount the way her son was lost, but also the way in which he lived. He spoke multiple languages, he was well-read, he was active on campus and was studying political science, he had friends. And though his short life was beset with trials, including attacks, substance abuse, contraction of HIV, and indeed murder, Matthew Shepard remained kind, caring, outgoing, and concerned about other people right up to the end. This book tells that story. In October 1998, another Matthew that you may have heard of, named Matthew Shepard, lost his life. He was murdered in Laramie, Wyoming. This was a person I remember having heard of. Probably, I even watched some of the press coverage. But I was 6 going on 7 at the time. And at that age, you're not really aware of the world around you. But I do remember this kid's name, in the same way that I remembered O.J. Simpson's name, or Michael Jackson's name, or Princess Diana. These were people who I really didn't appreciate who they were, not fully, but because, for various reasons, their names were in the headlines at that time and throughout my early childhood, I knew who they were to some extent. And something similar happened with Matthew Shepard. I always kind of remembered his face, and knew his name, and knew that he'd died, knew that he'd been killed. But that was it. That was really all I could have told you about him. Now, when I was a kid, I had no idea what it meant to be gay, or for somebody to be called gay, or any number of slurs on the playground. That was a common occurrence. So I knew it was an insult. To my perception, that's all it was. And even though, as I pointed out, I'd had crushes on girls before, I didn't really have any sense of what romance was, sex. Life was innocent then, you know. I didn't understand. I couldn't have articulated what a crush was, even the ones that I knew I'd already had. So my perception of what the word gay meant was completely, almost unformed. What I eventually came to understand, just through the instruction of my parents, was that, they just told me that it was talking about those who had same-sex attractions, and that they didn't have anything wrong with that. My mother had a couple of friends throughout her life that were gay. My grandmother's best friend in the world was a gay man. I was told that my doctor, my pediatrician, was gay. So it just wasn't a problem. And I never really understood everybody else's sort of fixation with it, or obsession with it, or insistence on using it as a slur or a put down. I just knew that it wasn't a big deal for my parents. And so the idea that Matthew had been killed because of this, it really made no sense at all to me. But then so few things in the world did make sense to me. I was 7. So anyway, time goes by, I grow up, and I find myself in the workforce. Now, I don't particularly like the job that I have, and later this month, this October, I'll be turning 30. And I'd be lying if I said that I'd accomplished everything I thought I would by the time I was 30. I'm still going to school. I'm still pursuing my career goals. I'm not in a committed relationship. I don't have children. There's all sorts of things I could say that I haven't done. I haven't been nearly to as many countries as I'd like to have visited by now. I've only left the country twice. So, there's all these things that I look at and I go, wow, I feel really kind of unfulfilled. No, at the end of last year, so in December of 2020, I was working for a different company than the one I'm currently at. And I was having a really difficult experience with a client. I won't go into the full details, but it was basically like a 17 or 18 hour long day. And I was unable to leave and just focus on my own mental health because they had a potential gas leak and safety situation that I needed to be on the ground and dealing with. And they were just like a very, very difficult and supremely ungrateful personality. Just like a very abusive person, you could tell. And when I left that night, after having done my job to the best of my ability, for the first time ever, I'm driving away, and tears started forming, and I just started. I pulled over, and I needed to just have a moment. I was just miserable. I felt really, really just bad about myself, about my choices, about my place in life, about the way that other people are, and I was really kind of in a sort of poor, pitiful me phase there for maybe a solid couple of weeks after that point. Some of that was probably due to the fact that, at that point we were well into the still ongoing pandemic. I I didn't have opportunities to see a lot of people in my sort of friend circle, like in person. A lot of the usual activities I would take part in, I hadn't been able to. The younger members of my family that used to spend a lot of time don't come around so much anymore because they're teenagers and doing their own thing. And the older members of my family are getting too old to do much of anything. So it's just kind of been like this weird, especially isolating and lonely time of change all throughout. And so for the most part, my life has consisted of just going to work, going home, and doing little besides. At least at that point, I didn't really have much, and I'd been working so much, I'd been so busy that I didn't really have a creative outlet. So everything was just getting to me. And I think that that's why, starting with that night, just sort of misery and just like everything had really gotten to me to the point where just emotion started flowing out of me, and I was really like not in the healthiest mindset. So I thought an old habit that I'd kind of developed as a teenager was sometimes if I would experience a story, a true story, mind you, that dealt with like a especially traumatic or troubling, disturbing material of some sort or another, I found that although the reading was never joyful, it somehow was comforting and sort of restorative to me, because it helped me put my life and my problems back into perspective. And so I intentionally decided to look up a story like that. And around that point in time, there were two different channels that I found that were doing interesting things. One of them is by a lady named Georgia Marie, and then the other channel is called Scott on Tape. They have a steady output, and they talk about crime in general, though in different ways, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But both of them had episodes devoted to the Matthew Shepard murder. So I listened to both of those, and then I thought, you know, it's really sad that my whole life I've kind of known his face and his name, and all I can tell you is that he's some dead boy, you know? I didn't know anything at all about him. So I looked him up to see whether a book had ever actually been written, and to my surprise, not only was one written, but it was actually written by his mother, Judy Shepard. So the book that I'm talking about today is actually called The Meaning of Matthew, the subtitle being like My Son's Murder in Laramie and a World Transformed. It did have the effect that I'd hoped that it would on me, where it really helped me kind of knock myself out of my own kind of funk that I was in and really kind of put my own problems back into perspective. But it also was sort of beautiful because it wasn't just about the murder. It was about who he'd been. It was about the family as a whole, how they'd related to one another, what they thought about one another, all written from a mother's perspective. And I didn't actually read this one. I listened to it on audio. I will say that it's a difficult book to listen to, and I'm not rating her narration performance. She's not a professional narrator. She's a mother who's lost her child. And that's exactly what it sounds like. So it's sort of heartbreaking to listen to, but I sort of feel that these people have actually had to live this nightmare. It's not the worst thing in the world for us to experience that sadness by proxy. And in my case, I actually found it, like I said, sort of healing. And I'm just grateful for her ability to share all this with such honesty and with such grace. You can never really know another person. And certainly we can't hope to know him as well as his mother did. But there's a barrier between the two of them as well, because for a significant portion of his life, he didn't live in the same country as his folks. His father, Dennis, held a job, I think in Saudi Arabia. I can't remember exactly what his title was or what he did for a living. But while he was there, while his father was working there, Matthew spent his time at going to school, sometimes there, and sometimes in America, sometimes in, I think, Switzerland. And so there were times where his folks really weren't anywhere near him. And at the time that he actually was beaten to the point where he'd injured his brainstem from something like 18 or more strikes to the head with the butt of a pistol. When that happened, his parents were in Saudi. So the book starts with that phone call from half a world away, where his mother and father are woken up to be told what's happened, and then they then have to make all the preparations necessary to fly out to see their boy, with his head bashed in, lying vacant expression in the hospital, blank-faced, bruised, eyes open. I can't imagine. Even after his death, his mother learned things about him that she didn't know. She knew he'd been sick, and I think they both believed that he just had the flu at the time. But he was actually HIV positive. And years prior, there was an incident where he was attacked by a gang of men and raped by multiple members of his circle. Just on some night when he'd gone out exploring by himself one day. So this is somebody who really didn't seem to be able to catch a break in life. And at the same time, the book is brimming with just glowing accounts about what a nice person he was, what a kind person he was, what a optimist he was. It's a really powerful story, I don't know. I can perfectly understand that what I'm saying might seem strange or dissonant in some way, but if you're having a hard time, I highly recommend reading this book and books like it, because to me, like I said, it just helps pull things back into perspective. And I don't just know about the misery. I also know about what a wonderful family he came from. He had a brother named Logan, his parents, Judy and Dennis, very loving family, very caring, very supportive. Everything that we're told about what life was like growing up, about raising their children, about them doing the best they could within their communities, within their fields of industry, the work that they did. These people seem to me to be like the best of America, just like the best that this country produces is these sorts of people. And they've been fighting ever since the loss of their boy, for equality, to right wrongs, to get the word out, the sort of activism that the world does need. And they also devote a fair amount of time into talking about an entirely different case, the horrific, equally horrific, if not more so, if such a thing is possible, murder of James Byrd Jr., who was a black man who lost his life in Jasper, Texas, who was beaten and chained to a truck or car, who cares, and dragged until his body was torn to pieces, which happened the very same year that Matthew lost his life. In 2009, October 2009, I believe, an act named in the memory of both James Byrd Jr. and Matthew Shepard was signed into law by President Obama concerning the prosecution and trying of hate crimes. But there's just such a selfless quality to Judy Shepard in her writing of this book. And although it does focus on some of the most horrific subject matter that you can imagine, it also celebrates life and light. I believe a jogger discovered Matthew. He'd been beaten and left tied to a post like a scarecrow out in some field. And that's what the jogger, the cyclist, or whatever he was, thought he was when he first laid eyes on him. Thought it was just a scarecrow, and then he realized, oh my God, that's a person. And when he called for help, the officer who came was a woman named Reggie Flutie, who was with the sheriff's department. Officer Flutie spoke with the family and related what she'd found when she got there, and she said that among other things, she described how he'd been beaten so badly that his face had been covered with blood, except for the places, these little streams where tears had fallen throughout the night before he'd been discovered. He was beaten at night and left for something like 18 hours out in the cold before somebody came across him. And he was so small. He was attacked by two assailants, two fully grown men. And Matthew, though he was in his early 20s, he was only 5'2" and 105 pounds when he died. And Officer Flutie actually mistook him for a child, a minor. And she just sort of kind of rode with him in the ambulance, sort of doing what she could to clean him up and talk to him and reassure him and say, it's okay, baby boy. We're gonna find out. We're gonna take care of you. We're gonna find you. We're gonna find your folks. And so we live at a time now when there's, at times with good reason, a lot of misgiving about people who work in law enforcement. But I do hope that we don't lose sight of the fact that there are people who do good work, who wear that uniform. And I thank Officer Flutie not just for her candor and her strength in dealing with a job like that, but also in having to tell that story to the family, but also for the way in which she phrased it, and for the fellowship that she showed them as human beings. And the other moment that, the only one that did in fact move me to tears, was, I mentioned that all throughout the book, Judy's narrating it, aside from one portion, and that's when her husband, Matthew's father, Dennis, gets up to read a statement that he read to the people who murdered his son during their sentencing in court. And I don't really remember the actual statement he made. Certainly I can't recite it to you verbatim. But what I do remember is just how difficult it obviously was for him to read that without crumbling. His voice breaks a few times, and it's just so obvious that he's doing everything he can to get through that statement without just coming completely unglued. And at that point, I really just I couldn't, like I did, you know, like I cried for him, you know, as I was listening to this. It was a book that I found profoundly moving. It was a story that I think deserves to be shared and retold and remembered. And of course, you know, as I've said, I always kind of knew that this happened around October, but I didn't realize as I was putting together my plans to really start focusing on my book channel and put content out, I didn't realize how close I was to the anniversary, as the attack took place 5 days before Matthew actually passed away. And he lost his life on October 12th, 1998. So I thought I would do what little I could to help preserve his memory. And I suppose my final point is, I think that a book like this probably is beyond the usual 5-star rating. That isn't really the point of reading something like this, judging it. It's not really a work of art. It's not a novel. It's not meant to be entertainment or to make a commentary about the way in which the artist sees the world. And yet, I think that is actually what Judy managed to turn this into. I don't know that she would think of herself as an artist at all. But I can tell you that I believe she is one. And 4 stars means that I really liked or loved something and highly recommend it. 5 stars is something that I think you should read not for entertainment. This is something that transcends personal taste. What it really means is, I think you owe it to yourself and to the world, because your life will be better off for having read it. You'll be a better person for having read it. And in that spirit, this is an easy 5-star rating. A crime like this is so senseless that I think it's incumbent upon us, for those of us who go on, for those of us who are still walking, talking, living, breathing in the world today, it's incumbent upon us to give meaning by remembering the individual, resolving not to focus on the condemnation of the perpetrators, but on love of our fellow man and women and anything in between, okay? Because if you can't do that, then, you know, what are we doing? The great author James Baldwin said that if you can't love, it is to be dangerous. It means you're dangerous, among other things. And as a final point, I would like to point out to the YouTube channels where I sort of regained an interest in this case. Georgia Marie, she focuses on true crime explorations. Through her channel, she really explores the details of a variety of cases, and some of them are not all crime, some of them are just sort of historical oddities or strange occurrences. But she's very diligent and quite accurate, and very well researched, and a great presenter. And so if you'd like to learn more about this story, I highly recommend checking out her channel. Any of her videos are good, but the relevant one here is, of course, her coverage of the Matthew Shepard case. And then also Scott on Tape. I don't know too much about him, and I haven't watched one of his videos in a while, but I've seen a good 4 or 5, and he's doing something very unique. What Scott does is he goes around to the places where a lot of these people lose their lives in senseless acts of violence. And he sort of documents the whole thing with his camera at things like grave sites and markers, and just tells these stories with a lot of love in his heart. And I think that's a really, really amazing thing, to go and stand in the places where these people fell, you know, and to remember them and say their names, and speak so lovingly of them. Of people he's never met, but just stories that he's moved by. So really, and in fact, he has an episode dedicated not only to Matthew Shepard, but also to James Byrd Jr. As well. And I'm very grateful as well for the experience of having read this, because from now on, when I hear his name, when I see his face, from all the good stories that the book does share, from all the personal little anecdotes and asides that his mother is able to impart, and his insights about his sensibilities on this or that, or the friends he'd had in his life, it's not that I feel I know him, but I know that he was somebody. And when I look at his face, I don't just see the face of a dead boy, you know? And that's a good thing. That's a great thing. Yeah, it's like I don't know what else I can say. I'm sure that this was a rambling mess of a video, and not at all the sort of content that I'll usually be producing, but it was relevant to a book that I did read. It is timely because of the anniversary, and it's something that I really wanted to share with you guys. So once again, the book is called The Meaning of Matthew by Judy Shepard. 5 enthusiastic stars. I can forgive that if you may not be in the mood to read it now, but I do think that you owe it to yourself, to the world, to Matthew, and to every other victim of such heinous injustice and violence, to read this book at some point in your life. Thanks so much for watching, and whoever you are, I hope you're doing well, and I hope you have a great day. Have a good one.